Okay, wonderful. Well, we'll start with this, and we'll let other folks in as they come. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I see some new faces and lots of familiar faces as well. I'm here tonight on behalf of the Outdoor Ministries Institute, and we're very excited to have Tom Appleyard joining us from the Camp Safety Network to share a little bit about board succession planning. So I'm going to hand it right over to Tom. We'll have a chance to hear from him, and then also a chance for a few questions at the end as well. Tom?
Terrific. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for inviting me to be not only part of this meeting this evening, but it does feel kind of special to be part of your long weekend as well for many of you, or Family Day week. I'll take a moment here to pull up a slide deck. Can you see that as full screen, or is it not full screen?
It's not full screen yet.
Not full screen. Okay. Is that better?
There you go. Yeah.
That's got it. Okay, terrific. Thank you. Okay, so again, my name's Tom Appleyard. I couldn't resist. I tried, but I couldn't resist the pun of board succession planning is planning for your board to succeed. So that's what we'll talk about this evening. And my name, again, Tom Appleyard. I'm an independent management consultant and facilitator. I'm also part-time faculty at the Schulich School of Business at York University, where I teach nonprofit management. My consulting and facilitation business, in that role, I'm a preferred vendor with the Ontario Camp. As Janice mentioned, and thank you for that welcome, Janice. I believe you heard from one of my colleagues a month or so ago, Robin Squires, about some employment law things I think he was talking about. So we are colleagues in the Camp Safety Network. I'll be talking about board succession planning, and really what this session will be about is thinking about identifying of the importance and the context of board succession, importance of it. Really going to focus quite a bit of my comments on fundamentals, things that need to be in place before board succession planning can happen. At least it's a good idea to have them in place. And then obviously some of the key steps for how to go about board succession planning. In terms of scope, I'm really going to focus on board succession planning for the board itself. Directors and what kinds of roles. So some of what I do that kind of thinking about, it may apply, but in terms of scope, my focus will be on its future composition. In terms of an agenda, so here are some of the things that we'll do as planning is, ways to think about it. Top 4 theories, also known as unpopular opinions of board succession planning. Some thoughts that I have. I wouldn't be surprised if you don't agree with all of these. So I'll say some of these in part to prompt some discussion and get your thoughts on. I will go through the whole sort of presentation and then stop, and there'll be opportunity for some discussion. So that will be Tom Appleyard's top 4 theories or unpopular opinions. Then, as I mentioned, we'll talk a bit about some of the fundamentals to have in place, how to go about doing some board succession planning, and then, as I said, opportunity for discussion. Okay, so what is this board succession planning? As I said, it's planning for the board to succeed in the future with a real focus on who. In terms of this, the focus for this presentation, it's focus on board succession planning. It's about who. Other parts of board work address the what, the why, the how. This is who's going to do the work in the future. And board succession planning can be thought of as an aspect of business continuity planning or continuity of operations planning. A lot of my work is in emergency management, so this is how I often think about these things, is how can we keep this organization functioning? And some of the concepts, business continuity planning or also continuity of operations planning, can be used in board succession planning. Concepts like scenario planning. What are some of the scenarios that we want to think about? Things like maximum, how long could we go without a place? Those are some of the ideas that can be borrowed from business continuity planning or continuity of operations planning. So we'll as we go through the presentation, I'll cite a few of those ideas. Board succession planning, I also believe, it's part of a board's duty of care to the organization. It's part of serving the best interests of the organization, is to think not only about what's happening now, but also what's happening in the future. And certainly it's a way to foster those seamless transitions so the board can continue to function at a high level, build trust of stakeholders, including community partners, but really importantly, also the management team, that the management team can rely on a fully functioning board of directors as it goes through certain transitions. I mentioned scenario planning as a key way to think about board succession planning. And there are three types of scenarios that boards can plan for. The first, the most obvious, and certainly the easiest, are those that are expected and planned and scheduled. In 6 months' time, we know we have an annual general meeting, and that will be the end of the term for 3 of our board members. And we know that they aren't planning on seeking another term. And so therefore we know there are those 3 spots to fill. And that's one of the scenarios to plan for, but it's certainly not the only one. There's also those emergency vacancies, that person who suddenly quits or is certain has a health crisis to continue, or is let go to 3 or 4 people all at the same time, either by coincidence or for the same reason. You know, having some thoughts on being ready to go for, you know, what would we do in those kinds of scenarios is important work to do. Then there are the ones that are kind of in between the planned and the scheduled, and those emergency kinds of vacancies. The ones that are those scenarios like, you know, that board member Jay over there, you know, we have a policy on this board that if you miss 4 board meetings, you know, you get kicked off the board, and they've already missed 3. Or, you know, that person over there, they just don't seem to be into it this year. I don't think they're going to last the whole term. You know, this can also trigger some thinking for, you know, there's another scenario. There's a, you know, it's not official yet, but I think we should start thinking about the fact that that person is going to be leaving the board of directors. So that's another scenario to think about. So that at a high level is how I propose we frame board succession planning, some ways to think about what it is. I'll stay at that high level and share with you, as I mentioned, Tom Appleyard's top 4 theories, which may also be considered unpopular opinions about board succession planning for your consideration. So here's theory number one. Succession planning is not as important as functioning well now. As much as I'm going to say throughout the presentation that this is important work that matters, and I hope everyone's doing it, it just doesn't matter as much as functioning now. I do know, and I expect many of you do too, boards that spend so much time focused on how are we going to sort of get the most basic logistics in place, who's on the board or who's going to be on the board next year, that they actually don't spend a whole lot of time bringing value to the organization and the actual issues that it's dealing with right now. And these boards, I like to think of them in this way, they just sort of feed themselves. They don't actually bring a whole lot of value to the organization. I remember from my finance classes that $100 in 6 months is worth a whole lot less than $100 now. And that's another way that I like to think about board succession planning and the value of it. It's important. It's important work. But if it's crowding out the work of bringing value to the organization today, then it's taking up too much space. So that's theory number one. It's not as important as functioning well now. Here's theory number two. And again, at the end, I'd love to hear your reaction to these theories. It's a board responsibility. Board succession planning is a board responsibility. It's not a management responsibility. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that members of the management team can't support this work. Of course they can in really important ways. But ultimately, in terms of whose job it is, I would propose that it's a board job. And if it's not a board job, the risk there is that not only does that board become a board that just feeds itself, it can also become a board that it ends up eating the management team as well. Instead, not just not bringing value to the organization, it ends up taking away value from the organization because it's taking up so much management time in meeting its own basic needs. So that's another part of a second theory for your consideration. It's a board responsibility. Here's theory number three. Boards of directors are very, very strange things. Their roles are not intuitive. There's no other thing that any of us do that is like being on a board of directors. And that is, I think, a real challenge for successful board succession planning and particularly recruitment. Here's an example of a couple of statements that I think successful board members ought to be able to say. Successful potential board members, people who are ripe to be on a board of directors. They ought to be able to say these two things. There's an organization whose purpose I support. I'd love to be an advocate and a champion for that organization. Okay, that's pretty clear. Here's another thing that I think they ought to be able to say. There's an organization whose purpose I support. I'd love to hold that organization's management to account. And there is a little bit of a paradox in that can be difficult to understand. I love the phrase someone once told me about board members, that they are the loyal opposition to the management team. They're on side, and they ask the hardest questions that they can. They do everything to keep the management team's pencil as sharp as they can. And again, there's nothing intuitive about championing and advocating for an organization and doing that important work as well. It can be, and that can be a challenge and have implications for a successful recruitment, is that sort of, it's not an intuitive role that you're recruiting people for. Okay, number four. Again, you may not agree with any of these, but here's one more for your consideration. Last one. We know that directors have a duty of care. It's a legal obligation. They must make decisions in the best interests of the organization that they govern. There are requirements around either declaring or avoiding conflicts of interest. Directors have those. Members of an organization or other potential directors, other people who may be potential directors, the kinds of people that might be recruited, they don't have those same obligations. They don't have a duty of care. They don't have a requirement to declare or avoid conflicts of interest until they're actually sort of doing the paperwork and becoming a board member themselves. We know that this can create challenges with things like member votes. When a member votes on an issue, they do not have to keep the best interests of the organization in their minds. And I wonder if that also creates challenges with recruiting directors. And I'd love to hear, when we get to the discussion, does this create challenges for you? That the people who are being recruited, they do not need to keep the best interests of the organization top of mind, and they do not need to declare and avoid conflict of interests until they're sort of signing up for that process. Okay, so 4 theories. You may not agree with any of them. We'd love to hear your thoughts on those. Switching gears a bit, I'd love to talk about 4 things that I consider in this presentation, the fundamentals, things to have in place as a foundation for board succession planning. Before board succession planning, these things really need to be in place. We'll call those the 3 R's, diversity policies and culture that support those policies, looking back and looking ahead, and job descriptions. 4 things that we'll do a bit of a deep dive into. And I'd love to do this. I'd love, as I'm diving into each of those 4 things, if you would reflect on the board that either you're on or that you support as a member of a management team, if you would sort of jot down for yourself or make a mental note of how out of 5, how would I score this? How would I score each of these things for our board? So we'll go through 4 things, and at the end you'll have a number out of 20. When we get to the discussion part, I'd love to hear how you think your board did and what that means. Okay, so a bit of a deep dive into these 4 things. So starting with the 3 R's: requirements, rules, and regulations. This is about how much the people involved in board succession planning, and as you know, I've proposed that is a responsibility of the board itself. How much do those board members understand what the bylaws, what the articles, and what the laws say about certain things that will affect board succession planning? Director vacancies. How does a director vacancy work? The number of directors that can be on a board, the classes or groups of members, if there's any within your organization. For example, is there anything that may say something like, you know, these 3 seats on the board of directors, they of a particular faith group or members of a particular church or members of a particular region of a church, for example, or that these 2 seats, they belong to parents. Is that really clearly laid out? And does everyone understand how that works in the bylaws? Term limits. Do people know how the term limits work? What is the length of a term on the board of directors? And are there any limits on the number of terms that people can have? It's important, obviously, to know those things, how those things work. And what is the process for officially filling vacancies? How does it happen? So those are some of the kinds of things that I propose those board members who are leading this work really need to understand. Now, I certainly know that many of you aren't in Ontario, you're working in other provinces, but I do want to flag a few things in the fairly new OMCA, the Ontario Nonprofit Corporations Act. Again, I fully acknowledge this doesn't apply to all of you, but there may be comparable requirements in your region that speak to the kinds of issues that I want to flag here. In my experience, there are rules in the OMCA that aren't always well understood by boards of directors, and I'm citing a few of them here. This idea that a nonprofit organization must have at least 3 directors, that's in there. That a director is not required to be a member unless the bylaws provide otherwise, or if there's some other requirement. But based on the legislation, you don't need to be a member of the organization to be a director. A quorum of directors may fill a vacancy among the directors. That's how that process works according to the OMCA. It doesn't need to be sort of full membership. It could be a quorum of the directors. And then this one is an interesting one. A director who is appointed or elected to fill a vacancy, they hold office for the unexpired term of the director's predecessor. Just because it's a new person doesn't mean that position's clock restarts. The clock doesn't restart. That person is just continuing on the term of the person that they are replacing. None of that is intuitive. And so again, good for people who are leading this work to be really familiar with what some of those rules are. Another area of rules that it's good to be clear on is what's the basic membership model of the organization? What's the relationship between being a director of the organization and being a member of the organization? And there are many, well, there are several models anyway. I'll cite a few of them here. Is it an open membership model where anyone can, pay their $10 and become a member of the organization, and the members choose the directors, that kind of open membership model? Or is it more sort of a semi-open membership model where only certain people can become a member? Perhaps they need to be a member of a church, for example, and then those people can choose the directors of an organization. Or is it more of what's called a self-perpetuating board, where only the directors can select the directors? It's self-perpetuating, that other people don't necessarily have input other than the people who are on the current board. And there are other models, and there are various hybrids, but those are 3 that are often used. And it's really important that people understand what model is being used for the organization. So I've cited a few examples of what things that people ought to be aware of when they're leading board succession planning. And I'd love it if you could take a minute and just jot down or make a mental note, a number out of 5 for how do you think your board is doing on that knowledge base? Okay, fundamental number 2 that I'll speak about is diversity. And I want to cite particularly an article by a colleague of mine, Lieben Gebremichael, who wrote an article for Imagine Canada called "When We're Not at the Table, We End Up on the Menu." And here's a quotation from that article. His focus particularly is anti-Black racism and its relationship to equity and diversity on nonprofit boards. So here's what he had to say. If you want to increase the representation of Black communities or any other racialized communities in your governance and decision-making processes, I advise you not to make a recruitment strategy your first step. Start with the process of decolonization. So similarly to what I'm saying about that idea of these are foundational things, Lieben Gebremichael says that this is foundational. You don't start with the recruitment, you start with decolonization. So what does he mean by decolonization? I'm quoting again from the same article here. He says that decolonization begins with acknowledging the existence and impact of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, that it's about valuing and including perspectives, norms, principles, and methods of knowing from other cultures and communities. It's about creating a process of accountability for self and for the board. And it's about becoming an advocate and ultimately earning the status of ally. Again, these things are to be in place before recruitment begins. There was a study from Statistics Canada a couple of years ago, which said one of its findings was that participating board members in organizations with a written policy regarding the diversity of its board were more likely to report being members of diverse population groups than those in organizations with no such policy. Now, this may not be too surprising that the boards that have the policy are the more diverse boards, but it does speak perhaps to the value of having a policy. And that same study from Statistics Canada, interestingly, found that within the nonprofit sector, the industries that many of us call home are right at the bottom of that list. That sort of sports and recreation and religion. These are the nonprofit organizations that are least likely to do that, to have a policy about diversity on their board of directors, and arguably are, therefore, those that are going to end up being least diverse, perhaps. Value in having those policies, and you can see that the entire nonprofit sector has some work to do in this area, and particularly that sort of sports and recreation industry within the sector. So I'd love it if you would give yourself take a moment and reflect and give yourself a score out of 5 on how you think you're doing with that foundational work for board succession planning. Number 3, I call looking back and looking ahead. Can the board of directors do this? Can the board of directors look back at previous board evaluations and see what they say about gaps and needs on the board of directors, whether that's skills or representation or knowledge or whatever it is? Is there a board evaluation process that you can look to say, the past 3 board evaluations have said this, and that can inform our succession planning? This obviously requires that there's a solid board evaluation process in place. Similarly, looking ahead, this is the Wayne Gretzky's line of, you don't skate to where the puck is, you skate to where the puck is going. Does your organization have a sense of where it's going? Is there for example, a strategic plan or something about objectives in the future? And what does that mean for the board of directors? Who does our board need to be in order to govern the organization that is to be in the future? And obviously that requires a separate planning process. So this is all about, can the board do those things? Look back and look ahead to inform the board succession plan. So give yourself a score out of 5 if you've got an evaluation process and some sort of a strategic planning process that can reasonably inform a board succession process. Okay, number 4 is about job descriptions. Maybe the least interesting part, but obviously a critical part. Is there a job description for a board member that can help people understand the kind of strange thing that a board of directors is? Are there specific job descriptions for officer positions, such as, the obvious ones, chair or treasurer, or those kinds of roles, or other specified positions? For example, as I mentioned, are you representing a specific constituency like parents or a church, for example? Is that clear what that relationship means. What does representation of that group mean in that scenario? Is that built into a job description? Are there job descriptions for the various committees that help the board to get its work done? And for skills-based boards, or boards where there is, at least a partial skills-based component to it, are the specified skills needed? Is that outlined somehow in job descriptions? For example, if you're wanting to have a lawyer or an accountant or a human resources professional, is exactly what that means, is that outlined in a job description as well? Okay, so last one, give yourself a score out of 5 for your board. How you think your board's doing on having those job descriptions ready to go as foundational work before board succession begins. And then tally those up, and how did you do out of 20? We'll hang on to those thoughts for just a few more minutes until we get to discussion, but I'd love to hear your reflections on the score and what you think it means for your board in terms of upcoming work. Okay, so we've thought about what ways to think about board succession planning. You've reflected on some of my possibly unpopular theories and whether they make any sense to you. You've got some foundational work in place, and it's you want to actually do the work now, do some recruitment work and think through some of those scenarios. So how do we do this? And how do we make it an ongoing responsibility to plan for this, not just a crisis response when suddenly we've got 3 vacancies on the board? And clearly, and I'm sure many of you have this, some sort of a committee process to lead this work. And in many cases, that's done by a governance and nominating committee. And terrific to have the committee that's really thinking about and reflecting on the effective functioning of the board today, that they're also reflecting and thinking about next year's effective functioning. And how do we continue to function if this board that we're working on the effectiveness of right now, how do we deal with that if suddenly we're down? So not the work happen. Is there a standing agenda item so that committee solely just focused on board succession planning? Is there a standing agenda item at board meetings so that there's that constant thinking about where will we be in a year's time, or who are other people who at board level? Fits in with the job description comments I made a few minutes ago, is this concept of the vice chair and the value of being really clear. Is it the expectation that that person will become the chair? In my experience, I know I've met numerous people who have been vice chairs of organizations who are very happy in that sort of supporting leadership role, who have no intention of stepping into that role, in part because it might mean 2 or 3 times as much work, perhaps, depending on, of course, on the job descriptions in the organization. And if there isn't sort of very open dialogue around, what is that the expectation, that the vice chair will become the chair of the board, or the vice president will become the vice president of the board? If there isn't an open dialogue around what those expectations are, there certainly can be misunderstandings. Certainly, again, borrowing from that business continuity planning or continuity of operations planning, some of the how here is about prioritizing the work. Are there some positions on the board that it's more important that role is filled than other positions? Many of you, I'm sure, have used this idea before from risk management, of also thinking about the likelihood of a position being vacant and the impact of a position being vacant. Obviously, for example, if there's a vacancy there, that may have more impact than other positions. And in risk management, you think about sort of multiplying the likelihood of a position being vacant and the impact of the position being vacant to prioritize, to think about what positions do we need to be more proactive in building a plan for how we would fill them. Important to have consideration for what we'll call internal talent, the people who are already engaged in the organization, how to engage people to become either more, take on a more senior role or a role with more responsibility on a board, or to join the board in the first place. For example, other volunteers or even employees, depending on the potential of conflict of interest or your rules around that. How can they be engaged to join the board of directors? And then obviously the flip side of that, the importance of thinking about reaching outside the walls of the organization and the people who are already engaged. For example, as an intentional strategy to increase diversity. And here I certainly mean not only sort of cultural diversity, as well as diversity of thought, of the importance of bringing people from involved in the organization to participate on the board of directors, and how to do that. And really my final comments before I stop speaking at you, obviously, is about onboarding. That board succession doesn't end when someone agrees to be on the board, and whether that's part of the nominating and governance committee's scope or someone else's scope, but it is part of the board succession planning process, is that onboarding experience. And again, I would tack this on to the idea that this isn't a management responsibility. This is, the management can play a role in this. They absolutely can offer a lot and in terms of support, but ultimately if a board isn't going to simply just feed itself and in fact take value away from the organization, but it's going to have its own, take care of its own business and contribute to the organization, then the onboarding is also a board responsibility. So I'll stop there. Here are some of the things I'd love to hear from you, as well, obviously, as well as any questions that I'll try to respond to. Obviously, at a high level, how do you put the success into succession planning? What are some of your lessons learned? I'd love to hear, how did your board do on the fundamentals test out of 20, and what does that mean for any of your next steps? What about this idea of what are the implications that members or potential board members, they don't have a duty of care for the organization? So how does that affect anything for you in terms of recruitment? And then finally, just, I'd love to hear just how unpopular are my unpopular opinions. So thank you for your attention. Again, thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing and would love to hear any of your reflections or questions or answers to my questions.
Fantastic. I'm just going to jump in that you can either unmute yourself and talk, or you can also drop something in the chat and I can read it out as we go, either or.
Thanks, Janice. Great.
I like the fact that you say that the responsibility for board succession planning should be with the board, not with the management, because I think most of us have far too many other things to do, and supporting that's one thing, but having to coordinate it and organize it and be responsible for it is a whole nother kettle of fish.
Seeing a few thumbs up and nods there. Yeah. So yeah. And is that, in your experience, is it an expectation that it is a board responsibility, or is it the expectation that management really will lead that?
I've had it both ways, different places I've been.
Right.
And certainly having interviewed for a few different places where the board was not functioning well, that for me was a personal red flag.
Yeah.
As a management, I was like, no, I don't need to get involved in that. So,
right.
My personal experience would be more boards that are active about it are better. I found quite often they know the rules, they have the plans, but it's the actively, it's kind of that your term is over and who's doing the recruitment and getting the new person in. That's the piece where it seems to fall apart, right? Like everybody, we have the board manual, everybody knows the terms, and you've still got people there for 15 years because there's no actual movement to actively find the new people to bring on to cycle through.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, Erin.
Hi, folks. I am wondering if you have some advice about boards that are not, or whoever decides, are not functioning very well. How do you change that culture? Do you have an event? Do you have a weekend event and teach them how to be better board members? Or like, how much do you have some advice about how to get to do all these things that sound so right, but I know it's very ingrained in a way that maybe it would take a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm happy to make a few comments. I'd love to hear other people's answers to that too. And maybe, I mean, certainly a board evaluation process is pretty critical, and particularly one that is not just the board evaluating itself, but other voices involved in contributing to what the board evaluation says. I mean, until it's clear what the board is trying to achieve and whether that's happening or not, and whether that's also happening in a way that is consistent with the values of the organization. I mean, it does seem that an evaluation process is the first step of bringing that concrete awareness to what needs to be done. You mentioned sort of, do we bring people together for an education piece? I mean, certainly I'm a big believer that yeah, there is a role for that for boards. The role of a board is not intuitive, as I said, and there's a big role for education as well. So I see that as part of the solution, but we also know that organizations are complex for lots of reasons, and lack of knowledge isn't always the thing that makes boards not as effective as they need to be. I'd love to hear other people's comments in response to Kathy's question as well. I see Erin's question as well. Does anyone have a board evaluation process that's working or written well? Does anyone else have thoughts on either Kathy's question or Erin's question?
Yeah, my board of directors does have a board evaluation that they were doing once a year, but up until last year was the first year we missed it. And it was good. It came to us from Pillar Nonprofit Network, who is this region's sort of go-to for governance things.
Right.
And it was effective, but I think the problem was it was being done at the wrong time. So if our annual meeting is at the beginning of March and we're doing the evaluation at February, it really isn't useful for planning for succession and recruitment of new board members. But the actual evaluation was quite good. And Erin, if you want, I can share that with you. Or if you go to Pillar Nonprofit Network, they probably have it on their website, I would think too. But I can share it with you, Erin.
So Jill, you're saying it should be done a few months earlier than that? Then
I think so. If we're trying to recruit to fill those gaps, then we have to identify the gaps before we go into our recruitment process for the board of directors. So, we start looking at who we need and what spaces are needed. And my board chairs here, they can probably nod if I'm saying, but 4 months in advance, you were looking at it this year for recruitment?
was funny. Right when you unmuted, I was about to unmute too.
Okay.
But yeah, no, we do. And this year, I was new into the chair role this year, so we didn't get it fit in this year. But I do want to do it earlier because it, as Jill had kind of already said, like it makes it hard to identify the gaps right before an AMM. Like that's of no use. So doing that earlier, so then the committee for the next set of nominations like actually has the gaps. I found that when I was a board member, like just like a regular board member, we like this year I'd love to do things a little differently, but actually getting a chance to review all of them a little more all together than just for the chair and then the committee, like actually then putting it out to the board members, like these are the gaps we are missing. Having management actually, like someone had mentioned, having management review us. So it's not just the self-evaluation, like right now we're on self-evaluation and Jill and I talk all the time, but it's not the same as actually having our management review our performance, which I think is just as important as when we review them.
Great. Thank you so much. Stephen, were you going to say something as well?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment on the question about how you deal with, changing the way the board acts. Was made there was to bring me in as chair. Because I come from a governance background and not an operational background. So it just changed I had not been on the board at all, but I came in and said, okay, this is how a governance board runs. And so it was just a fundamental change there. And I think you're always going to have, to Kathy's point, and I'm not sure this is exactly what she was saying, but you're always going to have people that aren't going to do what you need them to do. And so it's going to be a matter of figuring out how can you fill the gap in the short term and then bring someone on the board who has a similar skill set that may not necessarily have the role as, property chair or treasurer or secretary or something like that, but who has a lot of those similar skills and can be groomed to be in that position. We have 3-year cycles, so we have 3 years where we can replace people, and so hopefully you're not looking at skill positions, if that term makes sense, more than 1 or 2 per year. We know, for example, that our secretary is a very, very long-term secretary. Our treasurer is absolutely fantastic, and I'm not just saying that because she's on the call. And so replacing those 2 positions will be tough. But we know, for example, we were able to get 2 lawyers on the board, so we know we got our legal issues sorted, and so it's a matter of saying, okay, every year you need to get 1 or 2 of these positions filled, and then you can move other people around on your board. Now, of course, it always depends on how big your board is, I guess. But we've gotten, we've had some success over the last 3 years trying to do that. But there is always the challenge of, but this is how we've always done it, which you hear a lot on boards too. And so you just have to say in those situations, but why? Why, that's an excuse, not a reason. And so you just have to, be willing to push back on that. But it does take a chair that's willing to do the pushing back. So that can be a challenge. And I won't pretend I'm perfect or anything. I just mean as an example, you gotta have someone who's willing to take that leadership on the board to say, this is what the expectation is now.
Thank you, Stephen. I see a question from Harry as well. It's around the number of people on boards. Something that anyone want to either put in the chat in response to Harry's, or anyone share anything?
people are typing. I was going to say, we, for my board, we have 9 people on our board, and 3 vacancies, sort of thing. So.
It looks like a lot are around 10 in the comments. A bunch of comments just came through really quick.
Great. Any other thoughts or reflections, or shall I get out of your way so you can continue your meeting?
I'd just say I'm guessing, I don't know everyone here, but I'm pleased to see there's board members here. That it's you very often the program or the director, the management, I guess you'd say. And I wish there were more. Of course, it's probably a bit of a challenge today, but I hope they get this. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Kathy. And lovely to see you again.
Fantastic. Any last questions for Tom? Harry, go for it.
I would love to hear your opinion of non-working boards versus working boards.
Yeah, I don't have any magical words on this. I mean, obviously it depends in many cases, I think, on, whether there is an employee. I mean, most nonprofit organizations in Canada have no paid staff at all. That it's entirely volunteer, every person in the nonprofit organization. And so obviously, in those kinds of scenarios, there's going to be more of an expectation of a working kind of a board. And if that has been the history, and organizations have brought on an employee or two, it can take some time for a board to learn that it doesn't have to be a working board to the same degree. So I don't think that either is necessarily bad, but working boards, working with working management can become pretty complicated pretty quickly. And so certainly that need for really clear job descriptions on both sides. What are your thoughts, Harry?
We went from a working board, excuse me, to a non-working board. We have full-time staff. It works much better for us in the fact that, I'll be honest, last fall I was invited to a United Church Camp board meeting. It went from 7 o'clock till 11, and the amount of time they spent on changing a light bulb, I couldn't believe it. And I thought, oh my God, and I really, really appreciate the non-working board. They do work. Their job is to go out and tell the story. Their job is to make sure that they're out there in the communities doing whatever, but the governance piece and that sort of stuff is where they lie. But it makes a humongous change if you can do that. It just, the working relationship with staff is crucial. I get that. But if you can afford a full-time CEO, then I would certainly look at doing that.
Yeah, it sounds, Harry, that there may be some parallel in your story and Stephen's story as well with the shift that he facilitated. I know that one organization that I've done some work with that was really, nominally agreed with wanting to make that kind of shift, but found it really hard. The thing that ended up making the difference was establishing a rule that their meetings can only be 2 hours long. They can't be 8 hours long. So, if we can only do 2 hours, whatever we can do in that 2 hours is great. And that really helped them to sort of unlearn how to be a working board. Carol?
Thanks. This has been really interesting. Sort of things that I probably should or did know, but they weren't top of mind because I've been involved with boards throughout my career, but I find that a nonprofit board is kind of different. My question is, have you got any suggestions for how or where you can find directors? As you know, the whole volunteerism and of your graph, I suspect that even for sports and religion organizations, it may be a case where, yeah, no one wants to get involved anymore, or they've been there and they're burnt out.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping that no one would notice that I didn't speak about that because I saw that, you know, as you were asking your question, Carol, I saw almost every head nodding that this is a huge challenge. And, you know, we know that in terms of volunteerism in general right now, it is going down in many parts of the nonprofit sector. I mean, people are exhausted and all the rest of it for all kinds of reasons. And so, I mean, the short answer, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to this one of where to find people. I mean, obviously, you know, people who are already involved in an organization, as I mentioned, you know, as a good source to bringing people onto a board, but I don't know if anyone has a better answer than I do on that. I'd love to hear it too. Yeah, it's the right question, Carol. Yeah, where do we get the people? Yeah.
For us, a couple of things that we've done, knowing some of our people want to be involved, but they're at that kind of transition stage in life, right? Finished university, maybe just moving on to a career, not really knowing where they want to be. We've approached a couple of them for very specific time limited projects. So, you know, hey, we know that you're passionate about the LIT program. Would you be happy to spend some time reviewing it with us?
Yeah.
Right. So hopefully it starts kind of that connection, not starts the connection that's already there, but starts that thought process of eventually, you know, maybe I would, you know, think about being on the board, but this is a way I can contribute now with the skills and the time and the whatever I'm willing to give up.
Terrific. Thank you.
There's just a few more comments as well. Harry was wondering average size of membership and where they come from. If anyone wants to drop a comment really quickly in the chat. And Jill mentioned finding board members is also a challenge. Do you have something else, Carol?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, we have been quite lucky in the last little bit because, and you can't have him, but Steve knows a lot of people. And as a chair, he's been able to, I don't know how he does it, but bends elbows backwards perhaps, or something like that. But we've got some new directors who I'm thing with a critical area with so many nonprofits. And so I'm on a couple of organizations, and as soon as they find out you're an accountant or a retired accountant, oh, well, you know, but, you know, I've got to kind of think about that because I need to move on. And, you know, I would like to think that I've sort of found my own successor. I've been taught that from a work point of view, that it's a good thing to leave and feel that you've passed the baton over. But again, don't know people who, yeah. So that's why I just thought you might have a few magic bullets.
I wish I did. Certainly, I'm also doing my best at the Schulich School of Business to convince some of those business students that a great way to get involved in a nonprofit is to be on a board, and some of them seem very receptive to the idea. So hopefully one day they'll bring some of those management and finance and accounting skills that they're learning to the boards.
Fantastic. Well, folks, we are going to wrap up because it is 9:30 or a different time, depending on where you are in Canada. But thank you so much, Tom, for sharing your expertise and insight with us this evening. It's much appreciated. And just a quick note for everyone else, our next meeting is March 20th, same time, 7:30 EST. We have a guest speaker, Chris Hudson, coming to join us in March to talk about youth and some of the things that they're facing these days. Great topic for program personnel, summer staff, if you've already hired some of your summer leadership team, or anyone else that might be interested. Everyone is welcome. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you in March.